So I want to discuss a little bit more about why we are confident that species evolve by natural selection. And so I'm going to introduce a few terms to you over the next few slides. And the first one is homology. A homology, or a homologous structure, is a similarity that results because you have a common ancestor. In other words, two different species have a structure that's kind of similar, and the reason it's kind of similar is because you evolved from a common ancestor that had that structure. For instance, the forearms of tetrapods. So I have a forearm, right? It has one long bone, two slightly shorter bones, a bunch of tiny bones, and then digits. All tetrapods have these. But if you go back to the fossils of the first, tiktaalik or lungfish that lived at the edge of the ocean, are the common ancestors of all tetrapods. They had fins that have this exact same bone structure. And so whether you are a whale or a bat or a cat or a human, I'm starting to sound like Dr. Seuss, your forearms look different in a lot of ways, but they have these similarities in the bone structure and in the way that they develop over the course of your embryonic and fetal development that are there because they are the same structure, right? They're a forearm, and they came from a common ancestor. And you can watch these as they develop, right? So comparative embryology shows you some homologies too. We all have pharyngeal pouches. We'll talk about these a little bit later. And tails, right? If you're looking at vertebrates specifically. And so early on, a chick embryo and a human embryo look very, very similar. Those differences begin to pop up later on in development. Organisms also frequently have vestigial structures. And vestigial structures are remnants of structures that used to be very important and served a function, but don't so much anymore. And these can be big structures, or these can be at the molecular level, genes that used to be functional that aren't functional anymore, but we still have an inactivated version of them in our genome, which indicates that we shared a common ancestor with organisms that still use those genes. Examples of vestigial structures would be like our coccyx, right? We have no reason to have a little tiny tail inside of our bodies. You fall on your butt and it hurts more than it would otherwise, right? That doesn't seem like an advantage, but we evolved from ancestors that had tails, and we haven't completely lost that yet. There are lots of examples of these. One other example is you have little piloerector muscles that are attached to your hairs on your body. And if you look at some organisms like cats, for instance, cats, they have those same muscles and their hair fluffs up, right? And when does it fluff up? Well, it fluffs up when they're cold because it traps air in between the hairs, and that air helps insulate, keep them warm. And it fluffs up when they're scared. And when they're scared, they're trying to look bigger, right? And more threatening, so that the other organism that they're scared of doesn't mess with them. Well, when do we get goosebumps? When do our hairs stand on end? Well, when we're cold or when we're scared. And as far as I know, no one's figured out any current function for that, but it still exists because our not so distant ancestors had a function for that, had a use for that. These homologies, homologous structures, homologous characteristics, are used to make evolutionary trees, which are hypotheses about how we think that evolutionary tree might look, how that pathway of evolution may have gone. And we used to use all physical data for that, and some behavioral. Now we can use molecular data too. We can look at proteins and their similarities and differences, and DNA, and we make things like this. We're going to look at a lot of figures like this in the future, but at this point, right, this is a branch point between one group of organisms and another, and this would have been the common ancestor of all of these organs. So number 2 is the common ancestor of amphibians through birds, all of these, and that ancestor had digit-bearing limbs, right? Tetrapod. This common ancestor number 3 was not a common ancestor of mammals and amphibians, but was a common ancestor of mammals and all the rest of these organisms. And it had an amnion, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later in development. But you've heard of amniotic sac, amniotic fluid. That's essentially what we're talking about here. Because feathers are something that are only found in birds, presumably feathers only evolved in the common ancestor of all birds and not in the common ancestor of birds and crocodiles and lizards and mammals and whatever else. Now this can get tricky because just the fact of similarity between two structures in two different species doesn't make them homologous, doesn't mean that you had a common ancestor that had that structure, because convergent evolution can cause two different species to have similar but analogous structures. Right? Convergent evolution means two different organisms that have not shared a common ancestor in a long time. Right? They have very few common features. Their ancestors did. Live in a similar environment, and they may respond similarly to that environment in terms of evolution, and they may come up with similar traits. And we call those similar traits analogous features rather than homologous. A great example of this is the wing. So if you look at the bat, the bird, and the insect, they all have wings, and the wings help them fly, right? But they didn't evolve from a common ancestor that had wings, right? Now, bats and birds evolved from a common tetrapod ancestor that had forearms, but not one that had wings, right? These wings evolved independently. And insects are on a very different evolutionary branch. Haven't shared a common ancestor with birds and bats in a long time. They also evolved these wings independently. They all evolved these similar structures because they all found advantage in flying, right? They all lived in a terrestrial environment and were able to get around, avoid predators, better capture prey in the case of the eagle. And so they evolved very similar structures because the laws of aerodynamics are the same for all of them, right? They all fly in a similar environment, and so they all have wings that come out on the side, have lots of surface area, are thicker in the front and thinner in the back, again, because of the laws of aerodynamics. The sugar glider and flying squirrel, let me move myself here, also look very, very similar. And they're both mammals, so they both share a common ancestor that was mammalian, had fur, all those things. But they don't share a common ancestor with these kind of wing-like structures that they have. They evolved them independently. These are analogous structures, not homologous, and they came about through convergent evolution. Right? Australia broke off of the main continent a long, long time ago, which is why they have such unique life down there, right? All those marsupials. Sugar glider is a marsupial, very different from this flying squirrel, but they both live in tall trees. They both found advantage in jumping from one tree to another and being able to stay in the air for an extra long time. And so they independently evolved a very similar structure in the face of very similar evolutionary challenges. Again, convergent evolution, right? They evolved from different roots and came together, and those are analogous structures rather than homologous. This can cause confusion when you're trying to put together an evolutionary tree that's just based on physical characteristics. So if I show you these three organisms, a shark, a dolphin, and a reindeer, and I asked you to tell me which of these two is the dolphin more closely related to, you would almost surely say the shark because they look very similar. But the answer is the reindeer, right? These two are mammals. Dolphins and whales evolved from hooved mammals that went back into the ocean. But it looks so much like a shark because of convergent evolution. These are both animals that are predators. They eat fish. They're fast swimmers through the water, so they are bullet-shaped, right? Very, not aerodynamic, I guess, aquadynamic. They have stiff pectoral fins to keep them stable in the water and a tall dorsal fin to keep them stable in the water so that they can move quickly and catch fish. Again, convergent evolution. And you may look at that last slide and say, how in the world do we know that dolphins and whales evolved from hooved mammals, right? We know they're mammals, right? There's a lot of evidence for that. They're warm-blooded. They need breathe. We'll talk about mammalian common features later in the course. But why hooved animals? Well, if you look at cetaceans, right? So Pakicetus is an extinct cetacean, right? An ancestor of whales now. And you compare to pigs and deer to hooved animals. I believe this is the talus, one of the foot bones. They have two little bumps down here, right? Whereas most mammals, like this dog, only have one little bump here. And that's one piece of evidence. There are a lot of other pieces of evidence, genetic and otherwise, that show similarities between cetaceans like whales and dolphins and other hooved organisms. And so you put together a phylogeny or an evolutionary tree that looks like this, right? Living cetaceans, these are a bunch of extinct cetaceans, are pretty closely related to hippos, and then a little bit more distantly to other even-toed ungulates like reindeer. Biologists will also often look at the geographic distribution of species, or biogeography, to examine how they evolved, right? So we know from a lot of geological evidence that Earth's continents move, and they used to be united in a big, large continent called Pangaea that has then broken apart through continental drift. It's separated, and we have what we see today with Eurasia and Africa and North and South America. And an understanding of that movement allows us to understand the pathway of evolution, right? And so you see some organisms, for instance, that are similar between the eastern U.S. and Western Europe, right? Because that used to be one place. So we have similar species across that time. South America and Africa used to fit together, right? But isolation often leads to interesting evolution of unique organisms. And so biogeography can also lead us to look at things like islands. And islands, because of that isolation, tend to have more endemic species, or species that are not found anywhere else in the world. This is one of the reasons that the Galapagos Islands were such a cool place for Darwin to go to put together his idea of evolution by natural selection, because they're pretty isolated from mainland South America, mainland Ecuador, and they're also isolated from one another, right? It's a string of islands, an archipelago. Hawaii is another great example of this, right? It's way out in the middle of the Pacific. So the organisms that have landed there became isolated quickly, and it's a chain of islands, an archipelago, and so some of the evolution that you see on Hawaii is very unique as well. You have birds that began, they didn't have predators, so they lost their defense mechanisms. They would start putting their nests on the ground, because putting your nest in a tree helps you stay away from predators, but it's a lot of extra work, and it's risky because those eggs can fall and break. So they evolved to be ground nesting. And now they're very endangered because we brought rats with us and snakes that found it very easy to eat ground nesting eggs. They have mint plants that don't taste like mint anymore. They look like mint, they have the same leaves, they have the same boxy stems, but they don't taste like mint because the compound that makes that minty taste is actually a chemical compound that's a defense mechanism against herbivory by insects. And they didn't have those insects out there to eat them. And so they lost that ability to be minty because it saved them energy in the long run. Lots and lots of very, very unique organisms that you find endemic to islands. Okay, I'm going to end here in a moment, but I want to make sure that we are familiar with the observations and inferences of Darwin. All right, remember, individuals in a population vary in their heritable characteristics, variation in heritability, and organisms can produce more offspring than the environment can support, which creates competition. And you can infer from those two things that individuals that are well suited to their environment are going to acquire more resources and therefore produce more offspring than other individuals. And if you do that across lots of generations, eventually those favorable traits accumulate in a population, and voila, evolution has happened, and a population looks different after multiple generations than it did before.